Welcome to Tales of Wild West. Snow came early that year, drifting down from the high peaks in slow, unhurried curtains, settling on the valley floor as though it meant to stay. Jonas Hale stood at the cabin door, one hand resting against the weathered frame, the other tucked deep in his coat pocket. Smoke rose thin from the chimney behind him, the last warmth of the morning fire fading into the pale sky. 2 winters had passed since the grave on the slope took his wife, but the sight of it, hunched under the weight of snow, still pressed against him like an unmovable stone. A letter lay folded in his pocket, creased from the number of times he had read it, though the words never changed. County regulation. Household stability requirements. Marriage by spring or forfeiture of land rights. Jonas had worked this ground with his hands until his skin split, had trapped these ridges until every trail was as familiar as the lines on his palms, and now a clerk with ink-stained fingers might take it away. In the weeks since the letter arrived, he had counted the women in town on one hand and found them already spoken for, gone to better prospects, or too tied to their own obligations to take on the weight of a mountain man's life. All but one. Clara Finch. He had seen her once or twice when bringing pelts to the mining camp store, a young woman, thin as a willow switch, hair drawn back in a plain knot, sleeves rolled above the elbow as she stirred some great steaming pot. The camp foreman called her the cook girl, in the same tone he might use for a mule or a skillet. She kept her eyes on her work, never lifting them when the men came in, never speaking unless asked. There were rumors she had no kin left, no pay but her keep, no claim to anything but her own hands. It was a long ride to town, but Jonas made it before nightfall, snow slanting in sideways gusts across the last stretch of road. The camp was alive with noise, men's voices spilling from the saloon, the clang of hammers from the blacksmith's shed, the smell of coal smoke and boiled beans riding the air. He tied his horse and stepped into the cookhouse doorway. Clara was there, just as he remembered, her face flushed from the stove's heat, a wisp of hair curling damp against her cheek. She glanced up only briefly, and something in her gaze was both sharp and distant, as though she had long ago learned the cost of being noticed. "I need a wife," Jonas said quietly when the foreman ambled off to fetch more flour. No greeting, no small talk, he had never been a man for wasted words. Her hand stilled on the ladle. "I'm not for sale," she answered, her voice low but steady. "Not asking to buy you," he replied. "Just asking if you'd come with me. Cabin in the mountains. Not much company but the pines. You'd have your own room." She studied him a moment, eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for the trick in his offer. Why? He could have told her the truth, that the land would be taken, that the county saw him as one more name on a ledger, but he found himself saying, "Winter's long up there. Work's easier with 2. Her mouth tightened. "And when spring comes? Then we'll see what the thaw brings," he said, though both knew there was more behind his words. The foreman returned, throwing Jonas a look that measured and dismissed him all in one pass. "She's got work here. Ain't got time for daydreams." Jonas left without pressing further, the wind biting through his coat as he mounted up. But the image of her stayed with him on the ride home, those guarded eyes, the way she didn't flinch from his gaze even as she refused him. 3 nights later the storm came. Snow piled against doors and windows, rattled the roof until it seemed the whole camp might be buried. On the second night, there was a knock at Jonas's cabin, faint, nearly lost beneath the wind. He opened the door to find Clara standing there, cheeks red, breath clouding the air, a small canvas bag slung over her shoulder. "Camp ran out of coal," she said simply. "They told me to keep the stove going without it. Figured I might freeze slower if I walked." He stepped aside, and she entered without ceremony, stamping the snow from her boots. He gave her the seat closest to the fire and set water to heat. Neither spoke for a while. Outside, the wind howled against the walls. "You still need someone for the winter?" she asked at last. "I do. I won't be a burden," she said, not as a promise but as a condition. "I know." In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in a white so pure it almost hurt the eyes. Jonas saddled the mule and loaded it with her few belongings. They set off before the sun climbed high, the snow creaking under each step. The journey was quiet save for the muffled crunch of hooves. She wore his spare gloves, too large for her hands, and kept the collar of her coat turned high. From time to time he caught her looking at the mountains ahead, her expression unreadable. By afternoon, the cabin came into view, smoke curling from its chimney, the pine beside it standing dark against the snow. He showed her inside, the wide plank floors swept clean, the scent of cedar still fresh from the firewood stacked by the hearth. "This'll be yours," he said, opening the door to the larger room. It held only a bed, a quilt, and a narrow dresser. She stepped in, running her fingers over the quilt's stitching. That evening, he sat by the fire mending a harness while she unpacked in silence. He wondered what had brought her to the camp in the first place, what it had cost her to walk away. But he didn't ask. Some stories needed to wait until the snow melted. Later, after she had gone to bed, Jonas pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The night was clear, stars scattered thick across the sky. He walked to the pine where his wife lay buried, the snow crunching softly underfoot. "I don't know what I'm doing," he murmured, looking down at the small mound. "But I can't lose this land. And she looks like she's had more taken from her than I have." A shadow moved behind him, soft and hesitant. He turned to see Clara at the edge of the clearing, shawl wrapped tight, her breath pale in the cold air. "You talk to her often?" she asked, voice gentle, almost cautious. "Sometimes," he said. She nodded once, then looked toward the grave. "Then maybe she already knows why I came." Her words hung between them, thin and fragile as frost, and for a moment the mountain seemed to hold its breath. The trail wound upward in a slow, steady climb, snow creaking under the runners of the sled. Jonas kept the mule at an even pace, glancing now and then toward Clara beside him. She sat straight-backed, hands hidden in his oversized gloves, gaze fixed on the line where the mountains cut into the pale sky. Her face gave little away, but he could see the wind reddening her cheeks, the faint tension at the corners of her mouth. The higher they went, the quieter the world became. The sounds of the valley, distant axes, the clatter of hooves on frozen ground, faded into the muffled hush of deep snow. Pines pressed close on either side, their limbs heavy with frost. From time to time, a clump would fall, breaking the silence with a soft thud. They spoke little. Now and again, Jonas pointed out landmarks, the fork where a bear den had been the year before, the ridge where the spring melt ran fast enough to strip bark from fallen logs. Clara nodded but asked no questions. He wondered if she was measuring the distance back to town, keeping her escape route in mind. By late afternoon, the cabin appeared through the trees, squat and sturdy, a thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney. Jonas led the mule to the shed, unloading her small bag and the sack of flour he bought in town. Clara stood on the porch, taking in the view, the slope falling away toward the frozen creek, the black line of pines beyond, the peaks crowding the horizon. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and smoke. Jonas lit a lantern, its warm glow spilling over the wide plank floor. He showed her the kitchen corner, the small table, the narrow shelves holding jars of beans and dried apples. Then he opened the door to the larger bedroom. "This is yours," he said. The bed was plain but solid, the quilt patched in mismatched colors. Clara stepped inside, touching the dresser's smooth edge. Her bag looked small against the wall, as though it could vanish with one careless gust. That night, Jonas cooked venison stew while Clara unpacked. The only sounds were the pop of the fire, and the steady scrape of his spoon against the pot. They ate without speaking much, just a quiet exchange when she asked for the salt, or when he offered her the last piece of bread. The next morning, dawn came pale and thin. Jonas was already outside splitting logs when Clara emerged, pulling her shawl tighter. He offered her a place by the stump to learn the weight of the axe. She shook her head but watched him work, her eyes following each rise and fall of the blade. Over the days that followed, a rhythm took hold. Jonas hunted and hauled wood. Clara baked bread, mended shirts, learned to coax the stove to hold its heat through the night. He showed her the path to the creek where the ice could be broken for water. She surprised him by hauling 2 full buckets back without spilling a drop. Ephraim came on the 3rd week, a bent, bearded man with eyes as clear as the winter sky. He brought sugar, coffee, and a sack of dried peaches. His gaze lingered on Clara, but without the hungry edge Jonas had seen in other men. Over supper, Ephraim spoke of the snowpack up north, the elk tracks he'd followed for miles, the whispers in town about Jonas taking the cook girl as a wife. Clara kept her eyes on her plate, her shoulders straight. When Ephraim left, Jonas noticed her standing by the window, watching the trail disappear into the trees. "You trust him?" she asked. "As much as anyone," Jonas said. Trust seemed a thin currency here, spent carefully, hoarded in silence. February pressed on, the cold biting sharper, the nights stretching long. One evening, Jonas came in late from checking his traps to find the cabin warmer than usual, the smell of something sweet in the air. Clara had baked a pie from the peaches Ephraim left. She set a slice in front of him without a word, then took her seat across the table. "This is good," he said after the first bite. Her mouth twitched, almost a smile, before she looked down again. It was a small crack in the ice between them, but enough to notice. The thaw began early that year. Snow softened on the roof, dripping steadily into the barrels below. Jonas patched the barn's south wall, while Clara cleared a path to the shed. They worked in quiet companionship, each tending to their tasks without the need for constant words. One afternoon, Jonas climbed onto the roof to repair a loose shingle. Clara was below, handing up nails when his boots slipped on the damp boards. He caught himself on the ridge, but not before she cried out, her voice sharp with alarm. He steadied, looked down at her wide eyes, the flush in her cheeks. "You all right?" she called. "Fine," he answered, though his chest felt oddly tight. That night, he found himself replaying the moment, not the slip, but her reaction, the way it broke through her usual reserve. Weeks later, as the snow retreated to the shadows of the pines, Jonas walked out to the pine tree at dusk. The grave was still there, the quilt of snow on top thinning, showing patches of brown earth. He spoke softly, as he often did, words carried on the evening air. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Clara stepped out, her shawl drawn close. She crossed the yard slowly, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground, and came to stand beside him. "I used to think about graves," she said, her eyes on the mound. "Wondered if anyone would bother with one for me when the time came." "You'd have one," Jonas said. She glanced at him, her gaze holding his for a long moment. Then she looked away, toward the dark line of trees. "I don't much like belonging to anyone," she said quietly. "But I think I could get used to belonging somewhere." The wind stirred the pine branches above, scattering a faint dust of snow over them both. Jonas said nothing, but the truth of her words stayed with him long after they went back inside. That night, while the fire burned low and the cabin settled into its familiar creaks, he caught her humming softly as she folded laundry, a sound so unexpected he almost thought he'd imagined it. But the melody lingered, weaving itself into the silence, a promise he didn't yet know how to name. And far off, beyond the edge of the ridge, a shadow moved on the trail, leaving tracks in the softening snow. The storm came sudden, rolling down from the high ridges with a wall of wind that rattled the shutters and set the roof to groaning. By nightfall, snow had swallowed the yard, blurring the world beyond the porch into a white so thick it seemed they lived inside a cloud. Jonas brought an extra wood, stacking it by the hearth, and barred the door against the cold. For 3 days the storm held them, the sky low and heavy, the wind circling the cabin like something with teeth. With the traps buried and the paths impassable, they found themselves face to face more than either was used to. Clara sat at the table, mending a sleeve with careful, even stitches. Jonas worked a whetstone over the edge of his knife, the scrape and hiss filling the silence. "You ever get tired of it?" she asked without looking up. He glanced at her. "Of what?" "All this. The quiet. The cold. The way winter seems to last longer than it should." He thought about it, the knife still in his hands. "Sometimes. But the mountain doesn't change for what I want." You learn to take it as it comes. She tied off the thread, biting it clean. That's easy for a man to say. Her words weren't sharp, just worn from truth. He set the knife down. Tell me about before the camp. Her eyes stayed on the fabric. Before the camp was another kitchen. Before that, a wagon that broke a wheel halfway through the plains. Before that, I was just a girl with parents who thought the West was a place where bad luck couldn't follow. She gave a faint, humorless smile. It followed. He didn't press her. Instead, he told her about the ridge where elk gathered in autumn, about the high meadow that turned gold in late summer, about the sound of ice breaking on the creek in spring. She listened, her hands still, as though picturing the places in her mind. On the second day, the stove's heat grew stifling, the air heavy with the scent of baking bread. Jonas joined her at the table for the meal instead of taking his plate to the bench by the fire. They ate slowly, steam rising from the bowls, the snow hissing against the windows. She told him about the camp foreman, how he'd once taken her boots in the night to keep her from leaving. Jonas felt his jaw tighten, but he only said, "He won't come here." The third night, the wind eased to a restless sigh. Jonas poured her a cup of coffee from the last of the beans, setting it in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it, eyes lifting to his for the first time in hours. "You treat people different," she said. "How's that?" "You don't take what's not given." He thought about it, then said, "Can't build a roof out of what you've stolen. Falls in sooner or later." Her gaze lingered, as though measuring the weight of his words. When the storm broke, the world outside was clean and sharp, each tree frosted, each shadow deep. Ephraim arrived that afternoon, snowshoeing in with a sack of salt and a coil of rope slung over his shoulder. He found them splitting logs together in the yard, Jonas swinging the axe, Clara stacking the wood with neat precision. "Storm treat you fair?" Ephraim asked. Jonas nodded. Clara only gave a small shrug. The old man looked between them, a faint smile tugging his beard. "Cabin looks warmer than it used to." That evening, they shared the stew with Ephraim. Clara laughed once, quiet, surprised, at something the old man said. Jonas caught the sound like a rare thing, tucking it away. After Ephraim left the next morning, Jonas found Clara outside, hanging laundry on the line. The sun caught in her hair, pulling copper from the brown. She was humming again, the same soft tune he'd heard once before. The days began to stretch a little, the light lasting past supper. Jonas took her to check the traps along the creek, showing her how to read the pressed shapes of paws in the snow. She showed him how to mend a tear in his coat so the stitch lay flat and strong. One afternoon, while repairing the barn roof, his boots slipped on the melting ice. He caught the beam, but the jolt sent a sharp pain through his shoulder. Clara was below, her face pale, eyes wide. "You hurt?" she called. "Just a jolt," he answered, lowering himself slowly. But she came to meet him, hands out as if to steady him, the worry plain in her eyes. He could feel the tremor in her grip before she let go. That night, she placed a folded rag and a small jar of salve on the table. "For the shoulder," she said simply. He nodded, the warmth in his chest unexpected. The thaw came fast. Snow slid from the roof in heavy sheets, the creek's voice growing louder each day. They began clearing the garden plot, working side by side with sleeves rolled high, dirt thawing beneath their fingers. It was late in the afternoon when Jonas noticed her pausing, eyes fixed on the trail that wound down from the ridge. A figure moved there, small at first, then clearer. A man on horseback, coat dark against the pale ground, riding with purpose. Clara's shoulders drew tight. She turned back to the earth, but her hands stilled on the spade. Jonas followed her gaze, watching the rider until the pines swallowed him again. "Someone you know?" he asked. She shook her head, but the lie sat heavy in the air between them. That night she said little, retreating to her room early. Jonas sat by the fire, listening to the wind shift against the walls, his mind turning over the look in her eyes when she'd seen the rider. Outside, the snow was nearly gone from the yard, but in the shadows of the forest, winter still lingered, holding its ground. And somewhere out there, A man was making his way toward their cabin. The storm had rolled in fast, as if the mountains themselves had exhaled it. Wind howled through the cottonwoods by the creek, rattling branches like bones. Rain slicked the roof of the small cabin, dripping down the eaves in silver strands. Inside, the lamplight wavered, throwing long, trembling shadows across the plank floor. Eliza stood by the table, her hands clenched on the back of a chair, watching the man across from her with a mixture of fear and something sharper, resolve. James's shoulders were hunched, his hair damp from hauling in the last of the firewood. His voice, low but hard, cut through the wind. "They're not going to let this go. You know that." She lifted her chin, though her pulse stuttered. "If they want to come, let them. I've hidden before. This isn't hiding." He stepped closer, the boards groaning under his boots. His eyes caught hers, green in the lamplight, intense enough to still the room. "They're coming for blood." A shiver slid down her spine. She thought of the man in town, the one with the scar splitting his cheek, his words cold as steel when he'd warned her. She'd brushed it off then. Now, the warning rang in her ears like a bell tolling for the dead. "I won't run," she said quietly. James's jaw tightened, the muscle twitching. He looked at her for a long moment, then away, to the window where rain blurred the night. "You've got more pride than sense," he muttered, but there was no malice in it, only something that might have been admiration, though he hid it well. The wind shoved hard against the cabin walls. Somewhere outside, the barn door banged open and shut in the gale. James grabbed his coat and went for it. She wanted to call him back, but bit her tongue. He moved like a man who'd carried burdens alone for too long, and she wasn't sure yet if he'd let her shoulder any of it. By the time he came back in, shaking water from his hair, the lamplight felt warmer. He tossed a small burlap sack onto the table, dried beans, flour, and a hunk of cured meat. "From the trap line," he said simply. Her eyes caught on the faint tear in his coat sleeve, the wetness seeping through. "You'll catch your death," she said, softer than she meant to. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat at the table, reached for the kettle, and poured them both a cup of bitter coffee. "If I do," he said finally, "it won't be from the rain." She sipped the coffee, the taste sharp on her tongue, and tried not to think about what that meant. The silence stretched, filled only by the hiss of the stove and the storm outside. Then came the knock. It wasn't polite. It was a fist-pounding, quick and hard, the kind of knock that carried no patience. James was on his feet before she could breathe. He crossed to the door, every line in his body rigid. When he opened it, 3 figures stood in the rain. Their coats dripped water onto the porch, hats pulled low, but even in the dim light she saw their faces, men from town. One of them stepped forward. "We're looking for her," the man said, jerking his head toward Eliza. His voice was thick with something ugly. James didn't move from the doorway. "You've found her. Now turn around." The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to say no, James. She belongs to no one." James cut in, his voice flat but edged like a drawn blade. For a moment, no one moved. Rain pattered on the porch roof, the wind whined in the trees. Then the man smiled, a small, cold thing. "You know how this ends." James shut the door in his face. The sound of its slamming was like a gunshot in the small room. Eliza stared at him. "They won't stop." "I know." He turned back toward her, and there was no hiding the truth in his expression. "Which is why you're leaving tonight." The words hit her like a blow. "I'm not." "You are." His tone brooked no argument. "Pack light. I'll get the horses." She wanted to argue, to tell him she wasn't a burden he needed to shuffle away under the cover of darkness. But the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't dismissal. It was protection, the kind that came with risk he'd rather take on himself than see her face. When he stepped outside again, she went to the small room she'd been using, her hands moving automatically to gather what little she owned. A shawl. A tin of sewing needles. A small, worn Bible. She paused over the last item, her thumb resting on the frayed leather cover. Outside, the storm seemed to ease for a moment, the wind's howl falling to a low moan. She caught sight of James through the window, saddling the mare with quick, sure motions. His shoulders were set, but she could see the weight pressing down on him. By the time he came back inside, her bag was packed. He didn't ask if she was ready, just nodded once, took the bag from her, and opened the door. They stepped into the night. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. The horses waited, their breath steaming in the chill. James helped her into the saddle, his hands warm even through her gloves. "Stay close," he said. She did. They rode without speaking, the path lit only by the weak silver of the moon through the clouds. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle in the brush a threat. She felt the tension in James's posture, the way his gaze swept the darkness. After what felt like hours, they reached a narrow pass between two ridges. James pulled up, his hand lifting in silent command. She followed his gaze to the rocks ahead. A figure stepped out from behind them. It was the man with the scar. He stood in the middle of the path, rain dripping from his hat brim, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. His smile was slow and deliberate, like a snake uncoiling. "Evenin', James," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Goin' somewhere?" The mist clung to the ridges, the horses shifting beneath them. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She could feel James's stillness beside her, not hesitation, but the moment before a decision. And in the quiet, the scarred man's smile widened. "I think the lady and I need a word." The air that morning carried the brittle promise of change. Gray clouds rolled low over the valley, pressing the horizon into a narrow band of gold where the sun tried to break through. Samuel stood on the porch, coat collar turned up, watching the dust lift and dance in the restless wind. Behind him, the cabin felt different, quieter, heavier, though the fire still burned and the scent of fresh bread clung to the air. Lily moved inside, her footsteps soft, her shoulders drawn as though bracing for a weight he hadn't yet named. He'd been up before dawn, splitting wood until his hands ached, trying to rid himself of the knot in his chest. 4 days they had lived in a strange half-silence, words exchanged only for what was necessary, the passing of salt, the asking after chores, the occasional murmur about the weather. Every time he looked at her, he caught the ghost of something in her eyes, fear or doubt, or the memory of a life she wasn't ready to bury. And every time, it hollowed him a little more. When she stepped outside, shawl pulled tight against the wind, her cheeks carried the faint flush of the fire. "You're going into town?" she asked, her voice low, almost testing the air between them. "Need supplies?" he said, not meeting her gaze. "And word came in, someone's been asking after you." The way her breath caught told him she knew exactly who it might be. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl, knuckles pale. "Then you can't go," she whispered. He turned to her, eyes narrowing. "If I don't, they'll come here. You want that?" She didn't answer right away, only stared out toward the ridge where the land folded into the distance. Her jaw worked, as if she were trying to find the shape of the right words and failing. Finally she said, "I'm not worth what you're risking." "You don't get to decide that," he said, sharper than he meant. The hurt that flickered across her face made him regret it instantly. "Lily," he added softer now, "you came here looking for a place to stand. You've got it. I'm not letting anyone drag you back." The wind rose, rattling the porch boards. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called, its cry thin and fierce. She nodded, though he could see it wasn't agreement so much as surrender to something she couldn't change. The ride into town was long and tense. Samuel kept his hand near the rifle tied to his saddle, eyes scanning the sagebrush and ravines. Each gust of wind carried the dry scent of dust and pine, mingled with the sharper tang of something that felt like danger. He thought about her back at the cabin, about the way she had stood in the doorway as he mounted his horse, hands clenched at her sides. He thought about the faint tremor in her voice when she said his name, as if it were both a warning and a plea. The town was busier than usual for a day so cold. Wagons lined the main street, and the general store's porch was crowded with men in worn coats, their boots tracked with mud. Samuel tied his horse and stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He made his purchases quickly, stacking flour and coffee and salt on the counter. It wasn't until he turned to leave that he saw them, 2 men at the far end of the store, watching him. One leaned against the shelf with easy slouch, but his eyes were sharp as broken glass. The other tapped his gloved fingers against his thigh, restless, coiled. They didn't move toward him, not yet, but the air between them felt tight enough to snap. On the ride back, the sense of being followed settled into his bones. The wind seemed quieter now, as if holding its breath. He didn't look back until the trail curved into the cottonwoods, and then he caught sight of them, dark figures on horseback, just far enough behind to keep him guessing. He reached the cabin at dusk. Lily was waiting on the porch, her face pale against the dark. "You saw them, didn't you?" she asked before he even dismounted. He hesitated. "Maybe. They won't stop," she said, stepping toward him. "You think you can scare them off, but men like that, they don't leave unless they get what they came for." He studied her, the shadows gathering under her eyes, the way her breath quickened though she tried to steady it. "And what is it they came for, Lily?" he asked quietly. For a moment, he thought she might tell him. Her lips parted, her gaze dropping to the ground between them. But then she shook her head. "It doesn't matter. What matters is you can't fight them all." "I've fought worse," he said, but the words rang hollow even to him. That night, the cabin felt smaller than it ever had. The wind battered the shutters, and every creak of the logs sounded like a footstep. Samuel sat at the table, cleaning his rifle in the lamplight, while Lily moved about the room in silence. Now and then, he caught her glancing at the door as if expecting it to burst open. When the knock came, it was soft, too soft for the kind of men he'd seen in town. He rose, rifle in hand, and opened it to find no one there. Only the dark and the cold, and on the porch rail, a strip of cloth tied in a knot. It was red, faded but unmistakable. He felt the blood drain from his face as he held it up. Lily froze when she saw it, the color leaving her cheeks. "Tell me," he said, his voice barely more than a growl. Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. "It's a warning," she said. "It means they've already decided. Next time, they don't knock." The lamp flickered, throwing their shadows long across the wall. Somewhere out in the dark, a horse snorted, the sound sharp and close. Samuel stepped forward, peering into the night, but saw nothing. When he turned back, Lily was standing straighter, her hands unclenched, her voice steadier than he'd ever heard it. "If they want me," she said, "you'd better know why before you decide to stand in their way." Her words hung in the room like the moment before lightning strikes, and Samuel knew that whatever truth she was about to speak would change everything.